Hello everyone, welcome to the 12th episode of Let's Talk Tokenization. Today we're going to talk about the tokenization of stressed assets on the blockchain. Episode of Let's Talk Tokenization. Just give me a quick yes if you can see and hear me clearly. So I'm going to just wait for the yes, and the moment I get that, I know you can all see and hear me, and I'll start off. Awesome. So obviously, let's start with the first concept, that what do we mean by this term stressed assets? So if I was to give it a formula, I would say stressed assets is equal to NPAs plus restructured loans plus written off assets. Now, NPA is a term a lot of us are familiar with. We keep reading about it in the news. An NPA, or a non performing asset, is a loan whose interest or principal installment has remained unpaid for 90 days. Different countries may have a different law around how many days that is considered. In India, it's primarily 90 days. Then there is a concept called a restructured loan. That means that the bank or the lender has given some extended time period or a reduced interest rate to the borrower, or restructured the loan in some way or the other after it was issued. Thirdly, there is a concept called a written off loan or a written off asset. So suppose the bank or the lender believes that there is no way we are getting back any of this money. In that case, they would write it off on their balance sheet as a written off asset. We've given up hope on it. Although they may still consider or keep trying to recover that money, but they legally declare it as written off. Now, these three kinds of things come under the definition of a stressed asset. I hope it's all clear to all of you till now. And if there are any questions, as always, just keep putting them in the chat. Shinam and Keshav, some people may not be able to put it in the chat depending on which platform they're watching this on. So you can copy paste that here. So now that we've understood what a stressed asset is, obviously the next question is, why would anybody want to buy these stressed assets? So for example, if you look at the government of India's platform, they've set up a very interesting platform called as the India Investment Grid. So what I'm also going to do is I'm going to put that link here. So I put it in the chat. I want you all to have a look at this site later or right now. Now, what they're doing in this is that they are listing a lot of these stressed assets so that people around the world can look at it and then possibly invest in them. Now, the reason that we would want to invest in something, firstly, is the returns. So, given the risk involved in investing in these kind of distressed companies, the rate of return is much higher than any other kind of an asset. Secondly, there is a lot of liquidity coming into this market. Because more NPAs are being transparently now reported, being put up on platforms, a lot of people are beginning to invest in them. And third, it's a very easy way for companies to do a cost effective expansion. So suppose you are in a particular industry and there are competitors from the industry whose assets are now stressed. You could actually buy them at a much lower price. So you could end up buying assets which are useful to grow your business, or you could buy out competitor companies at a much lower rate. So these are the three primary kind of benefits that the government of India's investment grid talks about when it comes to investing in non-performing assets. Again, any questions, just keep putting them. So now, obviously, the third question that comes in is, why would we want to tokenize this on the blockchain? How does that really make sense? Now, I would say the number one benefit would be the enhanced liquidity. So the logic is very simple and it applies to almost any kind of an investment asset. When we put it on the blockchain, we are tokenizing it. So we are converting it into small fractions. Now, a particular asset may be worth crores of rupees. So when it is listed on government and other platforms, you're expected to put that entire money in. However, once we fractionalize it, it becomes easier for people to invest tiny amounts of money and buy out that asset. So that's obviously number one. That enhances the liquidity. People around the world can very easily buy and sell. Again, the reason for this is when we even look at the stock markets. To participate in the stock market of a country, you need to be either from that country or then you need to have a broker there. And there's lots of complications in doing this. However, when we tokenize something on a blockchain, it's globally available. Anybody can very easily buy and sell. So even stressed assets, like any other asset that we talk about, gets more liquidity once it gets listed on a blockchain. We obviously have transparent ownership, and you also have the real time asset valuation because, and this I would say is probably one of the most important things, at the time of listing an asset may have a particular value, but after fractionalization you can come to know the updated market value every single second or minute. In real time you are able to see what the valuation or the market cap is. If you take the example of the stock market, now, before a company is listed, it's very difficult to know what their real valuation is as a startup or as a private limited company. But the moment you list it on an exchange, every single day that the exchange is open, you can see the real time share price value and the market cap of that company. Similarly, the moment we list any such kind of an asset on the blockchain, anybody around the world in real time can see the valuations. Any questions so far on what we've been discussing? So now I'd like to share some interesting information. So at HYFI blockchain, which as you know is a permissioned layer one blockchain, we are setting up something called as the stressed asset marketplace. This is a marketplace where anybody in the world would be able to list a stressed asset. We would then tokenize it. So we do only one use case, which is tokenization of real world assets. Now, tokenization, as you know, is a four-step process. And in fact, I'm going to be doing a free masterclass called the Tokenization Masterclass very soon. I'll announce that in a few days' time. So I'm going to explain in that masterclass what are these four steps. So step number one is the authentication of that asset. Step number two is the provenance, the history of ownership of that particular asset. Step number three is fractionalization, where we break that asset down into small chunks. And finally, is the fourth stage, which is the trading, where a peer to peer marketplace is set up and people can very easily buy and sell these from each other. So we have identified a very interesting stressed asset. It's a textile company or a factory based out of India, and that is going to be the first asset that is going to be listed in it. So over the next couple of days, you will get information on this. I'm sure you're following me or HiFi Blockchain on our various WhatsApp groups or social media channels. We'll be putting up the details there. And then we'll be doing a separate live session just on that particular asset to explain what it is and what are the kind of risks and the benefits of investing into that. But I believe that something like this, where we enable small companies, because a lot of the stressed assets comprise the SME sector, the small and medium scale enterprise sector. And especially because of COVID, a lot of them actually went into bankruptcy. So that kind of makes it very easy for a lot of these companies to come back into business. So that's one of the reasons that we are setting this up, and I hope all of you would also find that very interesting. So if any of you do know about such other companies who could benefit from this kind of tokenization, do get in touch with us and we'll definitely try to help them also. And the textile sector is something that we are kind of looking at in phase one, because I believe that's an extremely strong sector, but which has been impacted quite badly by various reasons. One being, of course, COVID. Another would be a lot of international competition. So I believe that these can become very, very valuable as investment opportunities. Now, let me share a question and let me answer that. How do we know that the asset is performing as well as it was projected to be? Is there legal liabilities from the initial owner of the asset to give the returns for the token holders? That's an interesting and a very good question. So let's try to look at it. Now, let's take an example of a normal company, not a stressed one, a normal company which gets listed on the stock market. On day one, first their IPO, they give you those documents and prospectus based on which you make a bid on the book building process, and you then say, okay, you get certain number of shares allotted. Now, on the first day, when it lists, is when you actually know what the market price is, because that's when we have a process called as the price discovery. That's why on day one in a stock market, we do not even have a circuit breaker which is applied. Now, I have a question. How do we make sure that that company is actually fulfilling what it said in its document? So there is always a small amount of trust that we need to put on the promoters or the people running that company. Now, that same thing would apply here. First and foremost, we need to trust that what the entrepreneur says, he's going to deliver. So that's obviously always going to be step one, and there will be some cases in which people not be able to deliver. Secondly, we would insist upon very regular reporting. So, depending upon the company it is and what kind of business they are in, they would regularly put up details about their performance, maybe on a daily or a weekly or a monthly kind of a basis. So, that is again something that the investors would be able to see. Now, ideally, I would say that the company should also be open to opening up its bank account to the investors. They should be able to see in real time what kind of money is actually coming in, what is the cash flow that is being generated. And I believe these token holders should be given a right to vote on different decisions being taken by the company, what to do or what not to do. And definitely, there would be a kind of a legal liability on the owner, that in case they carry out any kind of fraudulent activities or they don't do things the way they've promised to do, there would be a civil and criminal liability on them. Another thing that I'd like to tell you here, I don't know if you guys have ever seen this movie called Pretty Woman. Okay, it's a really old movie, uh, many years ago. Richard Gere was there in that, right? Have you guys seen that movie? And I'll tell you why I'm talking about that movie in the middle of a talk on stressed assets. Now, in that, Richard Gere's main role was he would do something called a leveraged buyout. So he would identify companies whose book value, which is in their records, was lower than the actual market value. So they had assets which may have appreciated in value, but the share price wasn't really reflecting that. He would then take a huge loan from a bank, buy out that company, strip the assets, sell them, and make a huge profit. I think even in the world of stressed assets, that is probably going to be a very good revenue opportunity. It's not necessary that when a stressed asset is fractionalized, you actually run that company. Not necessary at all. What you could do is you buy out the assets, sell them, and then return money to the token holders, and they could end up making a huge profit simply based on the assets. Because in a stressed asset, you can buy it at a heavy discount to the actual market price. So that's again one more thing that benefits this kind of a business model. Let me put another question up here. Depreciating assets like vehicles versus stressed assets like a company. What makes sense to tokenize? That's a very good question. Now, what I would like to say here is there are two very different assets. In something like a car or a truck which you're going to use, there's a limited lifespan. That's why the government allows you to charge something like a depreciation, because these are depreciating assets which are finally going to be scrapped. So effectively, their value is going to keep falling. On the other hand, stressed assets are not like that. Stressed assets are those who have already fallen in value, are now available at a discount, but now they are expected to go up in value. So let's say there was this 100 rupee company or $100 company. It made losses or problems were faced, and the price it's now available to you at 60. So at a 40% discount. But now once you put in the 60, you can turn the business around and then the value actually goes up. So I would say a depreciating asset and a stressed asset are two completely different ones. The depreciating asset is going to keep going down towards zero or scrap value. Stress asset actually is now expected to go up. So that was Tejashwini. I hope it was clear. The earlier question was from Alok Chandra. So good questions. Do let me know if you have more questions. Yeah, I see another one. This is from Zagros. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Given the distributed and international nature of blockchain, is the governing law based on where the company is located or where the investor is located? Excellent question. And again, very difficult to answer this. So it would depend on the assets. Now let's take an example. Let's take a very simple example of agricultural land in India. The law is very clear. A lot of Indian citizens are also not allowed to buy it, and foreign citizens are definitely not allowed to buy it. Now, in that situation, we would have to look at where is this asset located? India. We first comply with the Indian law. Then we look into the law of each country. Now, let's look at something like let's say an aeroplane, right? Now, there are not too many laws about who can and cannot own a private jet. But the private jet, by its very nature, is not going to be located in a particular country, but it may be traveling around the world. So in that case, there are certain elements of international law that would come in, plus whichever country that particular jet is registered in. Now, when we talk about stressed assets, the first thing we need to look at, what is the asset? Stressed is the general category, but what does it comprise? Does that particular asset block have agricultural land? Does it have a factory? Does it have machinery? So, for example, in the textile industry, you would have spindles, right? I think that's the name for them. They're used in the manufacturing process. What about cotton? So, that particular textile company would be holding a large amount of cotton, for example. Now, cotton becomes an agricultural commodity. What is the laws relating to that? So, I would say stressed assets that way, from the point of view of legal, is the most complex because each block of a stressed asset may be holding many different asset classes, from factory to raw material to the land itself. So the answer to your questions, Zagros, would depend upon what all assets does that particular block of stressed asset comprise, and then we will be able to figure out which laws of the investor's country apply and which laws of the main country where the asset is located apply. Plus, there are times where that particular company may have bought assets in another country. Say an Indian textile company has ordered for cotton from Egypt, but the cotton hasn't come, it's still lying in Egypt. So that's a foreign asset held by them. That may have its own set of legal issues to consider. So, yeah, that was a very interesting question, and I hope my answer made sense to you guys. There's another question from Alok Chandra. Basically, this mechanism works as a funding mechanism for the companies. So, when we talk about tokenization, one of the core principles or the reasons that we tokenize an asset is to enable the asset holder to raise funds without taking a loan against the asset or without totally selling it off. So there's no interest payment which is made when you tokenize. So the entrepreneur or the asset owner doesn't have to pay any interest, but they are allowing you as an investor to make profits on that. So yes, it does involve funding, but it's a little different way conventional funding today happens. And that's why a lot of people are looking towards tokenization of real world assets. So if you look around globally, I would say the most popular assets today that are being tokenized, I would say number one would be real estate. Number two would be treasury bills. Primarily, the US treasury bills today are being tokenized in a big way. I would say then there's the project that I work for where we've currently tokenized whiskey casks and we're looking at tokenizing other luxury assets. Now, I think stressed assets could become another very important asset class for tokenization. Let me take out another question. Alok Chandra's question is who does the initial audit? That's again a very good question. Now, ideally, what would happen is the asset holder, who's controlling that particular stressed asset, would appoint a government recognized valuer to do a valuation of the assets. Because what happens in many cases is at the time they went to the court for the bankruptcy proceedings, the value of their assets may be X, say land and other things. But a few years down the line, the value of some of those assets may have gone up and some may have gone down. So I would say more than an audit, probably the most important document here would be the asset valuation. And for that, every jurisdiction has government approved valuers. So they would do that valuation. Investors, depending on the amount here, may want to do a due diligence. So they may appoint someone else to do a valuation to check whether all of that makes sense. And then again, a more detailed audit can be done. So depending upon the size of that asset, you may hire a CA to go and do that, or you may appoint somebody to do that. Or if the amounts are lesser and you're more confident about the project, in that case, you may not want to do an audit and you may straight away invest based upon the valuation report that has been generated. Okay, IR has an interesting question. What do you think about tokenizing rubbish? Now, okay, I'm presuming you're talking about waste. So, are you talking about things like plastic waste or maybe electronic waste, e-waste? Is that what you kind of have in mind? I'm presuming that's what you have. You could add to that question. I think that's a good idea. So, what we've got to see is that what's going to be the revenue model of that particular waste product, right? So, for example, there are lots of stringent laws around the disposal of electronic waste. So a bunch of people may come together to fund this entire operation of picking up waste from one country and then getting it dumped into another country. Now, in that kind of a situation, I think it's a very good business idea, right? So I do know of a few people, and they actually made a lot of money by through the electronic waste disposal. So they would pick it up from one country and then route it through another country and then sell it in a third one. I think there's a lot of money in garbage or rubbish, so to say. Yeah, so I think that's a good idea. In fact, then there are also these contracts that are given out by governments or municipalities to clean out certain cities. Well, I would say even something like that could be a tokenized model where people around the world get together and fund this project and then they take over the contract to get a particular city cleaned on a daily basis. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of money in tokenizing rubbish also. Interesting question, I hope. I hope that I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Any other questions? Okay, I'll wait for a couple of more minutes in case there are questions. As always, I will see you next Friday. So we do these sessions at 3 p.m. every Friday. I am going to announce a tokenization masterclass. You guys should attend that. And of course, we will do a special session on the first stressed asset that we are going to list. I have another interesting question from Zagros. Can we tokenize portions of the property rights rather than the property itself? For example, can you tokenize the right to the profit generated from the land without tokenizing the land itself? And that's a very good question. And actually, Zagros, next week's session is on exactly this. So the title for next Friday's session that I'm going to take is Tokenizing Future Profits. That can we look at SaaS companies to start with because their model is completely online. It's software as a service. Whatever money they make is made digitally. You can access their bank records and see exactly what is happening. So it becomes very easy for them to sell their annual profits. So I'm going to take a detailed session on this. And I actually believe, honestly, it is much better to tokenize rights rather than the actual property. And the reason for that is fairly simple. When we talk about, again, let's take an example of agricultural land. There's so many stringent laws that come in. We need to do so much due diligence before we trust that document. So it becomes difficult to do that. But suppose I say that you're a farmer, you've got an X amount of land, you are going to grow coconuts on it. I am not buying your land. I am buying next 3 years coconuts at these prices. Now the farmer knows he's going to get X amount of money. He doesn't need to bother about the fluctuations in the price. And as an investor, you don't have to do so much due diligence. You simply need to calculate whether the amount of coconuts likely to come from there justify your investment. So I think property rights are a very good way. Look at the mining industry. You don't actually buy the mine out. It still belongs to the government or the country or the people. What you get are mining rights for a certain number of years. I would say they are much better rather than a lot of the physical mines themselves. So yeah, I think Zagro, that's a very good point. And next week's lecture, we're going to talk a lot about this. Zagro's statement seems framework will help in farming. Yeah, sure. So the farming, I think, would be a good way, a very good use case for this. So there are people who do hydroponic farming, for example, or then there are people who grow specialized cash crops. Now they're not really interested in buying the land out, but they are going to invest in the mechanization and putting up the machinery, automating all that. So without getting into the actual land, they are tokenizing the investments which are being made on the land, and in return they make profit from the crops that are generated, and the farmer gets a good amount of money also. So I think, yeah, that's a very great way of doing things. Okay, Alok Chandra has another interesting question that these tokens would work as securities. So that's again a very good question that you've asked. It depends upon how we structure the whole thing. Now, the meaning of the word security is different in different countries, right? So if you look at India, for example, we have something called the SCRA, Securities Contract Regulation Act, and that very clearly defines what is a security and what is not a security. On the other hand, when we look at the American law, it's not very clearly defined what a security is. You actually go based on something called the Howey test, which is based on a Supreme Court ruling, which said for something to be called a security, it must satisfy these four criteria. So it would depend upon how we legally structure the stressed asset tokenization. Depending upon that, it may be a security or it may not be a security. So that's definitely one way that we would look at it. Another thing that I'd like to point out, and that's something a lot of people don't know, even if something is a security, you can bypass that definition if you do not allow citizens of that country to invest in it. So, a lot of projects which otherwise would be deemed securities in the US would say that US citizens cannot buy this, and then they bypass the US securities law. That's one more thing that some people do. But I think there's a better way of doing it. The US SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, actually has a list of situations under which you are not really covered by the stringent requirements of the security law, even though what you're dealing in is a security. So, based upon the amounts. Secondly, that if you are only allowing HNIs, there are definitions for that, and you verify that the person buying is an HNI or a certain level of investor. In that case, you may not come under the requirements of securities law, even though it's a security. So I always recommend that you should have a good law firm which advises you on this. So securities law is not really such a big problem. Securities law becomes a problem only in case of cryptocurrencies who already raised a huge amount of money and are now being considered securities. Cases are pending in the US, and let's see how that goes. It would primarily impact things like one, of course, is Ripple, another could be Polygon, and a lot of other cryptos have come in. Most people say Bitcoin and Ethereum wouldn't fit into that, but a lot of other cryptos are now in trouble under that. But there's been no real judgment yet. That was a good question. I have another question. When agricultural related projects come, any plan you're working on? Sure. So that's a good question. No, as of right now, we're not looking at agricultural related projects. I mean, I'm not saying we are averse to it, but as of right now, we're not working on them. But definitely, if we get some good projects, we would love to be part of that, and we'd love to help you guys raise funds for that. Uh, Another question is, you think tokenizing PPP, that's public-private partnership projects, will benefit in raising funds from retail investor? I definitely think so. Now, for this, there's a basic concept that we need to understand. What is the value that something like blockchain would bring in, which is not offered by, let's say, today's stock markets? Now, I would say one thing is that approaching the stock markets is a very expensive proposition. You need to spend, depending on the country, crores of rupees or millions of dollars to even list. Because you need to hire a lot of agencies, there are a huge bunch of intermediaries, there are approvals that you need. So it's not easy for every project to approach the stock market. So I would say that is problem number one. Problem number two, when we come to it, is the regulations. Because you are going to get listed in the stock market of a particular country, and then you may expand to one or two more countries. Now, that itself reduces the number of people who could actually participate in your endeavor. So, I believe where blockchain brings benefits in, firstly, the cost of getting onto it is very, very low. Secondly, it's open to a global market, so it becomes very easy for people to buy and sell the tokens. So, I would say definitely even a public private partnership where the government and a private entity are doing something like maybe building a highway or a bridge or some kind of a dam or any kind of an infrastructure project, an airport, definitely these can be tokenized very well. And if we ensure that the revenues of that project, so let's say it's a highway, now every time a car comes in, they're digitally taking money as a toll. If that is linked using smart contracts on the same chain, so you tokenize the project and the revenues also come in on the same blockchain, absolutely the whole thing can be automated. And every time toll comes in, a particular percentage goes to the token holders and the rest goes to the various entities who are there. So I think PPP projects are a very good opportunity. But what we must remember is the rate of return is always lower on infra projects. You can't really expect very high returns. That's just how those projects are. And they're long term. So you don't expect a highway to break even in a few years. It could take 20 plus years to actually break even and give profits. But other than that, yeah, I definitely think they are a good option for retail investors. In fact, while building such projects, many times the government takes over or buys up land of a lot of people who have it along that area. So maybe farms are taken up. Even those farmers could be given some of these tokens instead of being given cash upfront, and they could also then get money in the long run. So instead of a one time, they can actually get a share in the performance of that project over a prolonged period of time. So definitely it's a whole complete world in itself. Maybe we'll plan out a session in future on tokenization of infrastructure projects also. I'm very happy there are lots of really good questions today. So if there are more questions, please ask. Another thing I'd like to add, of course, when it's a stressed asset that we are tokenizing, again, like in any asset, always remember when we talk tokenization of assets, the tech is not the main thing, the legal is. So we need to make sure that that's handled very well. So, for example, one question which will always come in is who's the custodian? In many assets, for example, real estate, you may need a custodian who's going to actually control that property. You will need an operating manager who's going to actually make sure the property is maintained, rentals are properly taken, all of that. So this needs to be clear. So similarly, when we look at a stressed asset, depending upon what that asset is, we should look at who's the custodian, who's going to manage it, what are their credentials, how are we going to make sure they are doing it transparently. So those are the kind of things that the project needs to be very upfront with. Sure, I have an interesting question. In simple language, what is a stressed asset? Okay, so let me take an example. So let's presume that this is a factory, right? So it cost, let's say, $1 million to set up this factory. Now, to fund it, the people setting up the factory took a loan from the bank for $1 million. They created it. But because of business problems, they are not able to repay the loans on time. So there's an EMI they need to pay every month. They're not able to pay. So they approach the bank saying, we are unable to pay, restructure the loan, give us a longer period, reduce the interest. So we call that as a restructured loan. Or they could say, we are absolutely unable to pay anything, and the bank takes them to the court under the bankruptcy code, and a a professional comes in and reworks the whole thing. That the banks may have invested $1 million, but now they're going to have to lose 50% of that money, and they will only get half back, for example. And if you're not paying these interests and other things for 90 days, you are categorized as a non-performing asset. So all of these come under the definition of a stressed asset. So the simple one-liner would be any particular loan that is not being repaid on time, or which is being restructured, or where the bank has given up hope, is called a stressed asset. And because it is stressed, nobody is going to buy it up at 100%. People are going to bid a huge discount. You may bid 20%, 30%, that this is a $1 million thing, I will only pay 30%. So it gives an opportunity to people to buy out that asset at a lower price. And I would say, have a look at that movie, Pretty Woman, and see Richard Gere's business model in that. It's similar to this, where he takes a loan and buys out a company which has a lot of assets, whose book value is lower than the market value, takes a loan, buys that asset, sells the assets, repays the bank with interest, keeps the profit for himself. So it's an age-old kind of an investment model. Hope that answers your question. I'll give you a couple more minutes. If there are other questions, feel free to put them here. Okay, as of right now, I don't see any more questions. So it was great speaking to all of you. And like I said, I will see you guys next Friday. And very soon, I'm going to be announcing the tokenization masterclass. So do sign up for that. In that, we are going to go deeper into the uh, all the concepts of tokenization, including the tech and business and the legal. Uh, you want to know the name of the movie? I'm just putting it down. Pretty Woman. Yeah, it's a very famous movie. It's where Julia Roberts really became famous globally. I put that in the chat also. It's a Richard Gere, Julia Roberts movie. So you can have a look at that. Yeah. Nice speaking to all of you. See you next Friday at the same time. Bye bye.